Teachers of Reddit, what are some positive trends you have noticed in today's youth? I am a teacher at a high school in Missouri. All of the stereotypes you hear/see in rural high schools are still prevalent. However, almost every group works harder academically. It is no longer cool to get F's and fail. Even country boys who will never leave the farm or go to college care about getting passing grades. 600 plus students in our high school, by the way. Next story. Kindness. My college students are kind and supportive to one another most of the time. Next story. I asked my wife, primary teacher, and she says empathy and adaptability are the two traits she has seen dramatically improve over her last 15 years. Kids seem to be better at putting themselves in another's position and understanding their situation. Also, they seem to be much more flexible with changes whether in the classroom or the outside world. Next story. Spouse to a high school teacher, she had to say, they were born into the internet and social media, it is not something they had to learn. Also, as a result of which, they are also more self-reliant with research. And most importantly, contrary to the largest complaints, today's kids are extremely hard-working, and are less judgy of nerds, less judgmental in general. Next story. They are generally independent and self-reflective. When I first started teaching, I thought I had simply lucked out getting students who were consistently bright, engaged and curious, but having now taught at 3 different universities on 2 different continents, it seems to be a general trend across universities. They are also, as noted elsewhere, generally kind and empathetic, and both my male and female students are usually pretty emotionally mature. Next story. The 8-year-olds I teach really make a huge deal about plastic. We watched the Blue Planet 2 episode with them, and since then they have been so mindful and really want to protect the oceans. Next story. My daycare kids are much more likely to wash their hands than my generation was when we were their age. Lol. Next story. Kids are openly kind and loving regarding their parents. I had a tough football player day in class once. I love my mom, she's my best friend. I see the old my parents suck mentality falling by the wayside recently. Next story. Girls ask boys out more often. Boys are starting to expect girls to be more frank and straightforward with what they want more often. Other than that, just like my colleagues. Generally kinder, more generous, understanding of differences, mature. On the other hand, I find them generally more sad, maybe more cynical, and overall quite happily pessimistic toward the future, a kind of aha we're so effed vibe I feel sometimes. Edit, I got to say that I teach in France, it has its importance. Next story. I worried about my son, who has mild autism, for the first 10 years of his life. I kept telling him that middle school would be hard, kids would tease him, etc., and that high school would be even harder in the same respect. 15 years ago, I would have been right. Fast forward to now, and I'm constantly amazed and grateful for how well he is treated. Even the jock kids and big snotty idiot kids who would make perfect bullies are inclusive, kind, and even sometimes protective of my son. I've told all of them how appreciative I am, and even got a few of them Christmas presents this year. Love those kids. Edit, a few people are doing the math. My son is 11 and I'm 30. He's not in high school yet, but he will be there with the same kids he is in middle school with, so I feel confident about it. Next story. A realization that any sort of specialization is a good thing and that a 4-year college isn't necessary for everyone. Lots of my students want to go to tech/trade school or apprenticeships. They're learning from my debt-laden generation. Edit to add, Jesus people, I don't welcome my kids to class every day and tell them that college is for chumps and to become an electrician. If a student tells me their goals and they can be well achieved through trade or vocational school, I encourage that. If a student tells me their goals and they need to go to university, then I encourage that. Next story. I teach on the college level. From what I can tell, many of them seem more open to having a variety of kind of friends. Where I teach has a big hookup and party culture, but they seem to have genuine cross-gender friendships despite that, and in my opinion, that's been good for them. Edit, I feel like I should specify, since this comment blew up, that this is dependent on who's available to you in terms of variety. For example, I went to a very racially diverse undergrad and had all kinds of friends. My students go to a very white college and do not have racial diversity in their friendships as a result, but I think a fair amount that is structural. I also feel kind of like the bad guy here, but it's interesting that men in fraternities came up, because a lot of times they are the exception with my students. They'll really only hang out with their brothers, and depending on the fraternity, can be really awful to women. Next story. They really get each other. As much as they diss on each other, joke around, and yes, get to the point of blows, they can usually put issues aside. Sometimes to a fault, but overall they are pretty understanding of each other. Next story. The high school students I work with today seem significantly more emotionally intelligent than those of my generation, especially the young men.
They are aware of their own feelings and are better at separating their feelings from fact, i.e., they're more likely to say I'm feeling X, Y, Z, negative emotion right now than ugh, this teacher just hates me, what a jerk. They're also better at seeing and accommodating emotions in other people. There's more awareness of and sympathy for mental health issues. Here's an illustration. The other day, some of the students I coach were conversing and one young man asked how frequently they had a good cry. They all answered. And he said, I think I'm overdue for a good cry, and his peers started suggesting good movies to induce tears. It was an utterly shocking scene for me. Great, but nothing I would ever have expected.
Kids can be stunningly introspective and empathetic when you ask them to talk about their interpersonal issues. There's a real effort to perspective taking that goes beyond what I encountered at that age. Also, the students I work with have some selection bias, to be fair, but the ones I encounter as a whole care a lot about current events. It's like it's actually cool to know and care what's going on, and it's uncool not to. This is very different from how I grew up. I think a lot of them would agree with the statement being smart is cool and learning new things is fun, which seems simplistic, but isn't true to everyone. I think it's related to the pressure to get into college. This pressure to be more well-rounded in your interests is a double-edged sword. Kids get social capital from being exposed to different ideas and cultivating interests, but it's also a difficult race to model yourself into some ideal. Edit, I should clarify that I am a coach, not a teacher, so my sample size is more homogeneous. I am also in a unique position where I regularly interact with urban public school kids, mostly low-income students of color, largely white, wealthy suburban public school kids, and first-year college students. These observations apply across that spectrum. Next story. As someone who is a youth of today, I've literally never seen bullying. Where I live, people are kind of jerks sometimes but not bullies. Next story. Students are not afraid to just be nice to each other. I teach elementary art, and it is so nice when a kid who is pretty unskilled in art show another kid their work, and instead of getting laughed at, like when I was in school, kids are just so sweet and will say things like, "Wow, I really love that." I hear kids telling other kids, "I think your work is beautiful," or "I really like your ideas." And I just think of when I was in art, kids made fun of my work. In general, I really don't see kids being bullies as much as they were when I was a kid. I went to school in a really nice district too with few problems, but I was bullied. Kids here have a much worse home life than kids at my old school, and while they could choose to take it out on others, they don't. Kids help each other too. They know if a student is special and will try to help that student out. They'll offer to walk them to the bathroom, or help them with their drawing, or very politely tell them to be careful with things. Next story. They seem generally kinder to each other, especially to the kids who are different. When I was in school, the kids who didn't speak English as their first language, or were a little quirky or had disabilities, were either avoided or viciously bullied. Today that seems to be the exception rather than the norm. Next story. My GF is a teacher, and she said she's noticed a trend in kids actually making an effort to learn about what they care for, i.e. political issues and such. Unfortunately, there have been multiple cases where parents have called the school because their kid has come home not completely agreeing with their parents. This one kid's parents threatened to unenroll their student because they said they had a few conservative ideas and that the school/my GF was brainwashing him. My GF is progressive and works really hard to make sure she shows no bias. She felt pretty happy when that parent accused her, "Ha.